August 1944. General George S. Patton was winning the war faster than anyone thought possible. His Third Army had broken through German lines and was now racing eastward 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles a day. Entire German divisions were being destroyed or captured. Military historians would later call it one of the most successful campaigns in modern warfare. If you've never heard this story before, you need to stick around because what you're about to learn will change how you think about leadership, punishment, and what people actually fear more than death itself. This isn't just military history. This is about human nature, power, and the kind of decisions leaders face when all their options are terrible. Hit that subscribe button right now because by the end of this story, you'll understand something about social exile and identity that most people never grasp, and it applies to way more than just World War II. Now, let's go back to August 1944 and see exactly what Patton was dealing with. But on August 5th, 3 separate reports landed on Patton's desk that threatened everything. Not German counterattacks. Not supply problems. Something worse. His own officers were breaking. A company commander, West Point graduate, 15 years of service, found hiding in a basement while his platoon leaders fought without him. A battalion executive officer who refused to move forward during attacks, claiming he needed to coordinate from the rear. A staff officer who'd panicked during an artillery barrage so badly, his sergeant had to physically restrain him. Patton knew something most people don't understand about military justice. Having the legal right to punish someone and knowing the right way to punish them are completely different things. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, his authority was absolute. Cowardice in the face of the enemy capital offense. He could convene courts-martial. He could order executions. American military law gave him that power. But Patton had learned something the hard way. A year earlier in Sicily, he'd publicly confronted soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. Called them cowards. Slapped them. It nearly ended his career. The scandal was so bad that Eisenhower almost sent him home in disgrace. So now, staring at these reports of officer failures, Patton faced a choice. He could use his legal authority, formal trials, public courts-martial, possibly executions, or he could do something different, something quieter, something that would destroy these men without firing a single shot. What Patton understood, and what you'll learn in this story, is that in certain cultures, especially military cultures built on honor and identity, there are punishments far more devastating than death. He was about to prove it. By the end of this story, you'll understand why career officers would later write that they wished Patton had simply executed them instead. You'll learn how social exile works as a weapon. And you'll see why sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone isn't to end their life, it's to let them keep living after you've destroyed everything that made that life worth living. This is the story of why General Patton had the legal right to execute his failed officers, but chose a fate they considered far worse than death. July 25th, 1944. Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy, that military historians would later call one of the most spectacular offensive operations in modern warfare. General Patton's Third Army exploded through German lines like a sledgehammer through glass, while other Allied forces were still grinding forward mile by bloody mile. Patton's forces were racing across France at speeds that seemed impossible. 30 miles one day, 40 the next, sometimes 50 miles in a single day. To understand how extraordinary this was, the German army had expected to hold defensive lines for weeks, maybe months. Patton's Third Army was destroying or capturing entire German divisions in days. Whole enemy units would wake up to find American tanks already behind them, cutting off their retreat. It wasn't just winning, it was domination at a pace nobody thought possible in modern warfare. Patton's aggressive leadership style was working. Push forward relentlessly. Don't give the enemy time to regroup. Keep them off balance. Keep moving. His officers were executing this philosophy brilliantly, leading from the front, making split-second tactical decisions, keeping the momentum going. And then in early August 1944, 3 reports landed on Patton's desk that threatened to undermine everything. The first report came from a battalion commander on August 3rd. During an assault on a German fortified town outside of Ranches, a company commander had simply stopped. This wasn't a tactical withdrawal. This wasn't taking cover under fire. The officer, a West Point graduate, class of 1,929, 15 years of service, had made it to a French farmhouse during the advance. And then his body refused to go any further. His platoon leaders waited for orders. None came. The radio worked fine. The officer could hear the battle. He could hear his men calling for direction. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't function. Finally, the platoon leaders made the decision themselves. They coordinated the assault without him. They took the objective. They won the engagement. After the shooting stopped, a sergeant went looking for the company commander, found him in the basement of that farmhouse. Not wounded, not treating casualties, not coordinating anything. Just sitting there, back against the stone wall, staring at nothing. When the sergeant asked what happened, the officer couldn't explain. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His body had simply refused to move forward. It wasn't a choice. It was like his muscles had disconnected from his brain the moment he needed them most. The second report detailed a pattern, not a single incident. A battalion executive officer, the second in command of an entire battalion, responsible for coordinating multiple companies in combat, had developed a disturbing habit. During 3 consecutive engagements over the course of a week, he'd refused to move to forward positions. His excuse was always the same. I need to coordinate from the rear. Now, there's legitimate tactical reasoning for commanders to position themselves where they can see the whole battlefield. But his battalion commander noticed something wrong. This wasn't tactical positioning. This was a calculation to avoid danger. During one attack, the battalion commander specifically ordered him to move to a forward observation post. The executive officer found a reason why the radio worked better 500 yards back. During the next engagement, he claimed he needed to stay near the supply trucks to coordinate ammunition distribution. During the third attack, he said he was establishing a casualty collection point, which somehow required him to be a quarter mile behind the actual fighting. The battalion commander watched this pattern develop and realized the truth. His executive officer was finding reasons, plausible reasons, professionally phrased reasons to stay out of danger. He wasn't leading. He was managing to avoid the very situations where leadership mattered most. The third report was the most disturbing. A regimental staff officer had completely broken during an artillery barrage. Not a close call, not a direct hit on his position, just standard German artillery fire that any combat officer was expected to handle. When the shells started falling, this officer lost all control. Multiple witnesses reported the same thing. He started screaming incoherently. Not shouting orders or calling for medics, just raw, animal screaming. He tried to claw his way out of the command post bunker. His sergeant had to physically restrain him, hold him down to keep him from running blindly into the barrage. The sergeant's report was clinical but devastating. Officer was non-functional for approximately 15 minutes, required physical restraint. After bombardment ceased, the officer was unable to resume duties for an additional 20 minutes. Recommend immediate relief. Now, here's what most people don't understand about these failures. This wasn't cowardice in the traditional sense. These weren't lazy men or bad soldiers trying to shirk their duty. These were career officers who'd trained their entire adult lives for combat leadership. What they experienced was what we'd now recognize as an acute stress reaction, the psychological version of a physical wound. Their brains, overwhelmed by extreme stress, simply shut down. It's an involuntary physiological response. Their body's survival systems overrode their conscious will. The company commander in the basement didn't choose to freeze. His autonomic nervous system flooded his body with so much cortisol and adrenaline that his prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, essentially went offline. He was experiencing what modern psychology calls dissociation. The battalion executive officer was exhibiting avoidance behavior, a classic symptom of what we now call combat PTSD. Each engagement reinforced his brain's association between forward positions and mortal danger. His unconscious mind was protecting him by finding rationalizations to stay away from the threat. The staff officer who panicked during the artillery barrage had what we'd now diagnose as an acute panic attack triggered by combat stress. His sympathetic nervous system went into full fight-or-flight mode, and flight won. In 1944, the military didn't have this framework. They didn't have the language of PTSD, acute stress reactions, or psychological trauma. They had two categories. You could handle combat, or you couldn't. And if you couldn't, you were a failure. These weren't bad men. They were broken men. And that created a terrible problem for Patton. Because Patton had legal authority to deal with this problem in the harshest possible terms. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice during wartime, the options were clear and severe. He could convene a court-martial for dereliction of duty. The charge would be straightforward. These officers failed to perform their duties in combat. They abandoned their posts. They left their men without leadership when it mattered most. He could go even further and charge them with cowardice in the face of the enemy. Under the Articles of War in 1944, this was a capital offense, punishable by death. Patton had the legal authority to order these men executed. It had been done before in military history. Officers who failed in combat, who endangered their men through their failure to lead, could be shot. The law was explicit about this. The full procedural military justice system was available to him. Formal charges, investigation, trial, defense counsel. The entire apparatus designed to ensure justice was served. But Patton knew something that most commanders learn the hard way. Having legal authority to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And Patton had learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. August 1943, Sicily. Patton visited field hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering from what they called combat fatigue. What we'd now recognize as PTSD. Patton believed these men were shirking their duty, faking symptoms to avoid combat. He slapped two soldiers, called them cowards, told them to get back to the front lines. He thought he was enforcing discipline, maintaining standards, refusing to accept weakness. Instead, he created a national scandal. When the story leaked to the press, the American public was outraged. Newspapers ran headlines about Patton abusing shell-shocked soldiers. Politicians demanded his removal. General Eisenhower had to intervene personally. Patton was forced to make a public apology, something that nearly destroyed him psychologically. His command of the 7th Army was taken away. For months, he thought his career was over. The slapping incidents taught Patton that public, harsh discipline, even when he believed it was justified, could backfire spectacularly. It taught him that what worked on a parade ground didn't work in the court of public opinion. It taught him that sometimes the most direct solution created the biggest problems. So now, in August 1944, staring at these reports of officer failures, Patton understood that using the military justice system carried massive risks. Consider what a court-martial would actually mean. Time. Court-martial proceedings take weeks at minimum, often months. There would be formal charges drafted, reviewed by legal officers, served to the accused. Then an Article 32 investigation, the military version of a grand jury hearing. Then witness depositions. Then the actual trial with prosecution, defense, evidence, testimony. And while all this legal process played out, the Third Army was advancing 40 miles per day. The war wasn't going to pause for paperwork. Patton would need those officers replaced immediately, which meant the court-martial would be happening in parallel with the war, consuming time, attention, and resources that should be focused on fighting Germans. Morale. Public trials for officer cowardice would be devastating to Army-wide confidence. Enlisted men would read about their officers being charged as cowards and start questioning the entire leadership structure. If captains and majors were breaking under pressure, who could the soldiers trust? What did it say about officer selection and training that men who made it through West Point couldn't handle combat? Other officers would be demoralized too. They'd watch their peers being publicly humiliated, formally accused, legally prosecuted. Some might start second-guessing themselves. Am I next? If I have one bad moment, will I end up on trial? Politics. Executing American officers for cowardice would become a national news story instantly. The families of these officers would appeal to their congressmen. Newspapers would cover every detail of the trials. Editorial pages would debate whether execution was justified. Anti-war activists would use it as propaganda. The enemy would exploit it in their own propaganda. And Patton would be at the center of another scandal, another public relations disaster, another situation where his tactical judgment would be second-guessed by people thousands of miles from the battlefield. Patton had learned something from his mistakes in Sicily. Sometimes the most powerful punishment isn't the most public one. He needed these failed officers removed from command immediately. He needed it done quietly. He needed it done in a way that protected unit morale, avoided political complications, and kept the Third Army focused on destroying Germans instead of running military trials. The question was, how do you destroy a man's career, remove him from combat, and make sure everyone knows why without firing a single shot, without convening a single court-martial, without creating a single headline? Patton was about to show the entire Third Army exactly how it's done. If you're learning something about leadership and consequences that you haven't heard before, hit that subscribe button because what Patton did next changed how the entire Third Army understood failure. Patton developed a system, not a policy you'd find in any military manual, not something taught at West Point. A system that was swift, quiet, and brutally effective at destroying careers without firing a single shot. Here's exactly how it worked. Step 1. Verification. When a report of officer failure reached Patton's headquarters, he didn't act immediately. He didn't rely on a single account or rumor. He wanted facts. His staff officers would launch an investigation within hours. They'd go to the unit in question and start interviewing people. Other officers who were present during the incident, senior NCOs, the sergeants and staff sergeants who'd actually witnessed what happened. They'd review the tactical situation, look at radio logs, piece together exactly what had occurred. Patton wanted multiple independent sources confirming the same story. One officer saying another officer failed? That could be a grudge, a misunderstanding, battlefield confusion. 3 officers and 2 sergeants all reporting the same failure? That's a pattern. That's confirmation. This process typically took 24 to 48 hours. Fast enough to maintain momentum, thorough enough to ensure accuracy. Step 2. The summons. Once the failure was confirmed, the officer would receive a brief message. Report to Third Army Headquarters immediately. No explanation. No context. Just the order. The officer would make the journey sometimes hours by jeep from the front lines, often confused about why he'd been summoned. Maybe it was about the incident. Maybe it was something else. Maybe he was being considered for a commendation, a new assignment, a briefing on upcoming operations. He'd arrive at headquarters, be shown into a waiting area, and then escorted into General Patton's office. The conversations that followed were documented by multiple officers who experienced them. They lasted 2 to 3 minutes, rarely longer. Step 3. The conversation. Patton's words were direct, cold, and final. You have been relieved of combat command, effective immediately. No preamble, no explanation of the investigation, no discussion of what had happened. Just the verdict. You will be reassigned to. And here Patton would name a rear area position, a supply depot, a headquarters administrative section, an inventory management office. The officers would try to protest, try to explain what had happened, ask for another chance. Sir, if I could just explain the tactical situation. Sir, I know I can do better if you'd just... Sir, please let me prove that I can. Patton would cut them off every time. Same response, documented across multiple accounts. The decision is final, dismissed. No discussion, no debate, no appeal process. The conversation was over. Get out of my office. Some officers reported that Patton wouldn't even make eye contact after delivering the verdict. He'd already be looking at the next document on his desk, the next problem to solve. The failed officer had ceased to exist in his consideration. Step 4. Immediate reassignment. Often the same day, sometimes the next morning, the officer would be on a truck headed to the rear, 200 miles behind the front lines. 300, sometimes 500. The positions they were assigned to were deliberately humiliating. Supply clerk counting ammunition crates, tracking inventory on forms, administrative filing, organizing paperwork that any private with basic literacy could handle, logistics coordination, making sure trucks went to the right places. These were jobs that didn't require combat experience, didn't require tactical training, didn't require leadership ability. A major who'd commanded hundreds of men in battle would find himself doing work that an 18-year-old private fresh out of basic training could do. A captain who'd coordinated complex operations would be filing requisition forms in triplicate. Step 5. No formal charges. Here's what made this system different from a court-martial. There was no formal legal process whatsoever. No court-martial was convened. No official charges were filed. No legal proceedings initiated. The officer's personnel record would show a simple reassignment, the kind of routine transfer that happened all the time in a large military organization. No public announcement, no explanation to the press, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Just one day the officer was commanding troops in combat, and the next day, he was counting supplies 500 miles behind the lines. But everyone knew, and that's where Patton's system showed its genius. Because Patton didn't need to make announcements. The military grapevine did his work for him. Officers talk, especially in mess halls, in tents at night, during the quiet moments between operations. Word spreads fast in military units. Did you hear about Captain Williams? No, what happened? Froze during that assault last week. Patton pulled him. He's gone. Gone where? Supply depot somewhere. Patton sent him to the rear. The NCOs, the professional soldiers who formed the backbone of every unit, they talked to each other too. Sergeants swapped information with other sergeants. Our XO got sent to the rear by Patton himself. What'd he do? Kept finding excuses not to move forward during attacks. The battalion commander reported him. Damn. How long ago? 3 days. He's already gone. New XO arrived this morning. Within 24 to 48 hours, the entire battalion knew. Within a week, the entire division knew. Within 2 weeks, every officer in the Third Army had heard the story. And the pattern became unmistakably clear. Fail under fire. Patton finds out. You disappear to the rear. No trial. No appeal. Just gone. This created a deterrent effect more powerful than any court-martial could achieve. Because with a court-martial, there's process. There's a delay. There's uncertainty about the outcome. Defense attorneys arguing mitigating circumstances. Medical experts testifying about combat stress. The possibility of acquittal. With Patton's system, the outcome was certain and immediate. Everyone knew exactly what would happen if you failed. And they knew it would happen fast. But the real devastation wasn't the speed or the certainty. It was what this punishment did to the officers who experienced it. For career military officers, this was worse than execution. And you need to understand why. In military culture, especially among professional officers, your identity is inseparable from your command position. I'm a company commander isn't describing a job you do. It's describing who you are. Your entire sense of self-worth, your entire identity, comes from leading soldiers in the mission. Being removed from combat command meant you'd failed at the only thing that mattered. You were publicly declared incompetent at the fundamental duty of an officer leading men in battle. And unlike execution, which would end everything, you had to keep living with that failure. You'd watch your peers continue to command. You'd hear about battles you weren't part of. You'd see former subordinates, lieutenants who used to report to you earning medals, getting promoted, leading the fights you couldn't handle. You'd be doing desk work, counting supplies, filing paperwork, work so mundane it didn't require any of the training, experience, or skill you'd spent years developing. The social isolation was crushing. At mess halls, conversations would stop when you entered. Other officers would avoid eye contact. Nobody wanted to be associated with failure. Nobody wanted to be seen as friendly with the officer Patton had deemed unfit. Even the rear area officers, the supply officers, the administrative staff who'd never been in combat, they looked down on you. Because they knew. Everyone knew. You weren't in the rear because you were assigned there. You were in the rear because you'd failed in combat, and Patton had exiled you. The stigma was permanent, and it traveled with you. Some relieved officers requested transfers to different units, hoping for a fresh start where their failure wasn't known. Patton usually denied these requests. And even when transfers were granted, word traveled. The informal network ensured that your reputation preceded you. And here's what made it unbearable. There was no dignity of process. With a court-martial, the proceedings are public, but they're formal. You have legal representation. You can present evidence. You can call witnesses. You can defend yourself. You have procedural rights. Even if you're found guilty, even if you're sentenced harshly, you had your day in court. You got to tell your side of the story. The process itself provides a kind of dignity, the acknowledgement that you're entitled to a defense, that your perspective matters, that justice requires hearing both sides. Patton's system offered none of that. This was personal. Patton himself had declared you unfit. Not a panel of judges. Not a jury of your peers. Patton, the legendary commander, the general whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's in the Third Army. No defense, no appeal, no chance for redemption. You were simply erased from the combat roster based on Patton's judgment, and that was final. One officer who was relieved wrote about his experience in a post-war memoir. His words capture the psychological devastation better than any analysis could. I would have preferred a court-martial. At least then I could have defended myself, presented my case, and had my day in court. Instead, I was simply erased from the combat roster with no explanation, no chance to appeal, no opportunity to prove I could do better. It destroyed my military career and my sense of self-worth in a way that execution never could have. Execution would have ended everything. This made me live with the failure every single day. Think about what he's saying. He's saying death would have been better. Not metaphorically. Not as hyperbole. He genuinely believed that being executed would have been preferable to what Patton did to him. Because execution ends your suffering, exile makes you live through it indefinitely. Execution takes your life but preserves some measure of honor. You face the ultimate penalty for your failure. Exile takes your honor but forces you to keep living without it. This was Patton's innovation. He'd found a punishment worse than death. And the brilliant cruelty of it was that it required no legal proceedings, no formal charges, no public scandal. Just a 3-minute conversation and a reassignment order. Simple, swift, devastating. Every officer in Third Army understood the message. Your career, your identity, everything you've worked for can be destroyed in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. And there's nothing you can do about it. No appeal, no defense, no second chance. Just Patton's judgment and a one-way truck ride to the rear. This raises a question you might be wrestling with right now. Was this fair? Was it even legal for Patton to bypass the military justice system? Drop a comment below with your gut reaction, but before you decide, you need to hear what happened to the 3 specific men who experienced this punishment. Their stories will change how you think about justice, effectiveness, and what leaders owe the people they command. At least a dozen officers were quietly relieved by Patton during August and September, 1,944. Most of their names have been lost to history, buried in personnel files, forgotten in the chaos of a war that was producing thousands of casualties every week. But 3 cases were documented well enough that we can reconstruct what happened. 3 men, 3 different types of failure. 3 careers destroyed by the same swift, silent system. Their stories show you exactly what Patton's punishment looked like when it hit real people. Case 1. The company commander. August 3rd, 1944. Outside Avranches, France. An infantry company was assaulting a German fortified town. This wasn't unusual. Third Army was conducting dozens of such assaults every day during the breakout. Standard combined arms attack. Artillery preparation. Then infantry advance under covering fire. The company commander was a West Point graduate, class of 1929. 15 years of peacetime service. He'd trained his entire adult life for exactly this moment, leading men in combat. His company was advancing under fire. German artillery, machine gun positions, mortars. The kind of chaos that defines infantry combat: noise, smoke, confusion, men falling, orders being shouted over the sound of explosions. The company commander made it to a French farmhouse about halfway to the objective. A stone building that offered some cover from the German fire. And then he stopped. His platoon leaders, the lieutenants leading the individual platoons within the company, were waiting for orders. The assault was stalling. Men were taking cover, returning fire, but nobody knew what to do next. Should they flank left? Push straight ahead? Call for more artillery support? Withdraw and regroup? The radio worked fine. The officer could hear his platoon leaders calling for direction. He could hear the battle raging around him. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't function. One of the platoon leaders, a second lieutenant, 23 years old, barely 6 months out of officer candidate school, finally made the decision himself. He got on the radio and coordinated with the other platoon leaders. They worked out a plan between themselves. They executed the assault without their company commander. And they won. They took the objective. They cleared the German positions. They secured the town. After the shooting stopped, a sergeant went looking for the company commander. Found him in the basement of that French farmhouse. Not wounded. Not treating casualties. Not coordinating anything. Just sitting there, back against the stone wall, staring at nothing. When the sergeant asked what happened, the officer couldn't explain. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His body had simply refused to move forward. It wasn't a choice. It was like his muscles had disconnected from his brain the moment he needed them most. The aftermath moved with brutal efficiency. The battalion commander received reports from 4 separate sources, all confirming the same thing. The company commander had abandoned his position during combat. Not tactically withdrawn. Not been wounded or incapacitated by enemy action. He'd simply stopped functioning. August 5th. The company commander was summoned to Patton's headquarters. August 6th. He was reassigned to a 3rd Army supply depot 300 miles behind the lines. His new job, inventory clerk, tracking ammunition crates, making sure the numbers on forms matched the numbers in warehouses. 15 years of peacetime service. West Point graduate. Ended in one moment of paralysis. What his men said about him, and these accounts were documented in after-action reports and post-war interviews, tells you everything about how combat soldiers viewed this kind of failure. His platoon leader, the young second lieutenant who'd taken command during the assault. We needed a decision. Men were dying. He just wasn't there. His sergeant, the one who found him in the basement. I felt sorry for him at first. Then I remembered the 2 men we lost because nobody was coordinating the assault. Then I just felt angry. The company commander spent the rest of the war behind a desk. He requested a transfer to a different unit, denied. He requested a return to combat duty, denied. In 1946, he resigned his commission and left the Army. He never spoke publicly about what happened. Case 2, the battalion executive officer. This case was different. Not a single moment of failure, but a pattern that revealed itself over multiple engagements between August 10th and 15th, 1944. A battalion executive officer, the XO, the second in command of an entire battalion responsible for coordinating multiple companies in combat, had developed a disturbing habit. During 3 consecutive attacks over the course of a week, he refused to move to forward positions. His excuse was always the same: I need to coordinate from the rear. Now, there's legitimate tactical reasoning for commanders to position themselves where they can see the whole battlefield. Battalion and regimental commanders often operate from positions that give them visibility over the entire operation. That's proper command and control. But his battalion commander, the man he was supposed to be supporting, noticed something wrong. This wasn't tactical positioning. This was calculated avoidance of danger. During the first attack, the battalion commander specifically ordered him to move to a forward observation post so they could coordinate the assault from adjacent positions. The XO found a reason why the radio worked better 500 yards back. During the second engagement, he claimed he needed to stay near the supply trucks to coordinate ammunition distribution. The battalion commander pointed out that the supply sergeant could handle that. The XO insisted his rank was needed to expedite the process. During the third attack, he said he was establishing a casualty collection point which somehow required him to be a quarter-mile behind the actual fighting. The battalion commander watched this pattern develop and realized the truth. His executive officer was finding reasons, plausible reasons, professionally phrased reasons to stay out of danger. He wasn't leading. He was managing to avoid the very situations where leadership mattered most. During critical moments when decisions needed to be made, the battalion commander couldn't reach him. Other officers had to compensate, making command decisions above their rank, stepping into roles they weren't trained for. The battalion commander personally reported him to division. The division commander forwarded the report to Patton with a recommendation for immediate relief. Multiple officers were interviewed. All confirmed the same pattern. This wasn't one bad day. This was systematic avoidance of danger. The conversation with Patton, reconstructed from multiple accounts of similar conversations, followed the standard pattern. The officer tried to explain. Tactical positioning, radio coordination. The importance of his supporting role. Patton cut him off. Your battalion commander says you won't move forward under fire. Your company commanders confirm it. You're relieved. Sir, If I could just explain the tactical situation. Dismissed. Total conversation. Under 3 minutes. The reassignment came immediately. Division headquarters. Administrative staff. Processing paperwork. Filing reports. An office job that required no combat experience whatsoever. Rank. Major. Job. Clerk. The social cost was devastating. Other division staff officers knew why he was there. They treated him with cold professionalism. No camaraderie, no friendship, no inclusion in the informal networks that make military life bearable. He'd eat lunch alone. He'd work at his desk in silence. One officer described him in a post-war memoir. Like a ghost walking through headquarters. Technically present, but we all knew he'd been professionally killed. Case 3. The Staff Officer. August 20th, 1944. This case was the most tragic because it involved a single incident, a clear psychological break, not hiding or shirking. Regimental headquarters was taking German artillery fire. This wasn't unusual. Headquarters positions often got shelled. It was part of the job. Standard procedure. Take cover, wait it out, resume operations once the barrage stopped. The staff officer in question had been previously competent. No prior issues. No pattern of problems. By all accounts, a solid officer doing his job well. When the shells started falling, he completely broke. Multiple witnesses reported the same thing. He started screaming. Not shouting orders or calling for medics, just raw, incoherent screaming. He tried to claw his way out of the command post bunker. His sergeant had to physically restrain him, hold him down to keep him from running blindly into the barrage outside. After the bombardment ceased, the officer was still hysterical. It took 20 minutes to calm him down enough to speak coherently. The sergeant's report was clinical but devastating. Officer was non-functional for approximately 15 minutes. Required physical restraint. After bombardment ceased, the officer was unable to resume duties for an additional 20 minutes. Recommend immediate relief. Here's why this case was different, and why it's the most tragic of the three. This was a single incident, not a pattern of behavior. A clear psychological break. What we'd now clearly recognize as an acute combat stress reaction. The kind of involuntary physiological response that can hit anyone under extreme stress. The regimental commander actually advocated for medical evaluation rather than punishment. He argued that this officer had performed well up until this moment, that this appeared to be a psychological injury rather than a failure of character. Patton's decision was final. I can't have officers falling apart under artillery. If he can't handle shelling at headquarters, he certainly can't handle combat. The officer was relieved. Sent to Corps headquarters. Administrative duties. Never saw combat again. The tragedy becomes clear when you understand the context. In 1944, the military didn't have a framework for understanding what had happened to this man. There was no diagnosis of PTSD, no concept of acute stress reactions as medical conditions, no treatment protocols for combat psychological trauma. Post-war psychiatric evaluation would have likely diagnosed him with combat-related PTSD. Modern military medicine would recognize what happened as an involuntary physiological response. The kind that can be treated, managed, and potentially overcome with proper support. But in 1944, the Army didn't have that category. They had two options. You could handle combat, or you couldn't. And if you couldn't, you were a failure. He was branded with that label for the rest of his career. A letter to his family, discovered decades later in military archives, captures his psychological state. I don't know what happened to me. One moment I was functioning normally, the next I was convinced I was going to die and couldn't control my actions. The Army doesn't have a category for what happened to me except failure. So that's what I am now. A failure. The pattern across all cases. 3 men. 3 different types of failure. The company commander. A single moment of paralysis during an assault. The battalion executive officer. A deliberate pattern of avoiding danger over multiple engagements. The staff officer. An involuntary psychological break during an artillery barrage. But despite these differences, every case followed the same structure. Confirmed failure under fire. Quick investigation 24 to 48 hours. Relief from command immediate. Reassignment to the rear within days. No formal charges. But everyone knew why. This is what you need to understand about Patton's system. It didn't distinguish between types of failure. It didn't account for whether the failure was voluntary or involuntary, a pattern or a single incident, a character flaw or a psychological injury. The system treated all failures the same way: swift, silent, final. And that inflexibility, that refusal to recognize nuance or context, is what makes these stories so difficult to wrestle with. Because when you look at the company commander who froze, you might think, yes, he failed his men when they needed him most. When you look at the battalion XO who deliberately avoided danger, you might think he was calculating his own safety over his duty. Those cases seem, if not justified, at least understandable. But when you look at the staff officer who had a single psychological break, a man who'd served competently until that moment, whose regimental commander wanted him medically evaluated, rather than punished, the system's inflexibility becomes harder to defend. These weren't abstract cases. These were real men, with real careers that were destroyed. Men who'd spent years training, who devoted their lives to military service, who found themselves on the wrong side of a system that didn't have room for second chances or medical understanding. And every one of them lived with that brand for the rest of their lives. 3 men. 3 different types of failure. 1 outcome. Professional annihilation. Now, you might be thinking Patton was cruel, heartless, unfair. Or you might be thinking he was right that soldiers deserved better than failed leadership. Before you make your final judgment, you need to understand what would have happened if Patton had taken the other path. If he'd used his legal authority to court-martial these men instead. Because when you see the alternative, the choice becomes a lot more complicated. If this story is making you think differently about leadership and justice, do me a favor and hit that like button.